Leonora Carrington was born into a wealthy landed English family, living in a large mansion, Crookhay Hall. She was a rebellious child and had an interest in art from an early age. In her late teens, she studied art privately with French cubist Amédée Ozenfant, where she learnt the formal techniques of painting in a highly disciplined way. In 1936, she came across Herbert Reed's book on Surrealism, which included an illustration of Max Ernst's 1924 painted construction, "Two Children Are Threatened by a Nightingale." This had such a profound impact upon her that she wanted to create art in that style. A year later, she was invited to a dinner party at which Max Ernst was the main guest. They were immediately attracted to one another. A few weeks later, she left Britain for Paris and moved in with Ernst. There she met most of the Surrealist circle, and she began painting seriously. One of her earliest Surrealist pieces is her self-portrait in 1937, subtitled "The Inn of the Dawn Horse." They moved from Paris to a villa in the village of Saint-Martin-d'Ardèche in southern France, close to Marseille. There they had a short period of intense creative work before they both began to get caught up in the consequences of the beginning of the Second World War. It was at that time, in early 1939, she also created another key work, her portrait of Max Ernst. Ernst was first rounded up as a German alien and passed through a number of disturbing encounters with the authorities, both French and German. Carrington, being abandoned, was under considerable stress and left France for the safety of Spain. Her behaviour there showed such a degree of disturbance that she was placed into a mental hospital in Santander and was given some rather severe drug treatment. Here is the painting "Down Below" she made in 1941 that reflects her experience there. She also wrote about this in a surreal novel of the same title. She escaped the hospital and fled to Lisbon in Portugal, where she knew the Mexican ambassador, Renato Leduc. He gave her sanctuary and quickly married her, thus giving her diplomatic immunity and making it possible for her to leave for the USA in 1941. While still in Lisbon, she met up with Ernst, who was then living with Peggy Guggenheim. However, though still friendly towards him, Carrington saw the relationship as having ended. She moved to New York with Leduc, where he worked for a while at the Mexican embassy. There she met up again with the Exiles Surrealists. Here is a rather stylized posed photograph taken at Peggy Guggenheim's home of the group. Carrington, of course, is seated in the front row, second from the left. Immediately behind her, sitting between Ernst and Breton, is her earlier teacher, Amédée Ozenfant. In New York, Ernst was still trying to reawaken the relationship with Carrington, but she did not want to reopen a romantic attachment with him. As we have seen, Ernst was still infatuated with her, and often referenced her in his paintings of the time. Here is Carrington's painting "Green Tea," she created in 1942 whilst in New York. In 1943, she moved to Mexico with her husband Leduc. Mexico's left-leaning government of that time admitted many European refugees from the war, even granting them citizenship. In Mexico City, Carrington found herself within a small community of artists and intellectuals, including Remedios Varo and her husband Benjamin Perret, Katie Horna, the photographer, as well as circles around the Mexican writer Octavio Paz, Diego Rivera, and Frida Kahlo. She began to devote her time to painting and writing. She immediately seems to have found her mature style, as we see in The Distractions of Dagobert of 1945. This shows her immersion in Celtic mythology. Dagobert II was a 7th century Merovingian king. While he was a young prince, he was captured and sent to Ireland, and was supposed to have married Matilda, a Celtic princess. His life is interwoven with legend and myth. Carrington here creates one of her complex paintings, presenting a number of tableaux depicting what she saw as elements in the myth of Dagobert and his Celtic wife. In addition to Celtic mythology, Carrington was deeply interested in esotericism, alchemy, magic, and all things occult. She shared this with Remedios Varo, whom she met and discussed art and ideas almost every day. Indeed, the unofficial headquarters for the European Surrealist émigrés was the apartment of poet Benjamin Perret and Remedios Varo on Calle Gabino Barreda. The Mexican artist Gunter Gertzel, who painted some surrealist works in the 1940s, even created a painting about this residence, The Days of Gabino Barreda Street of 1944. Here he depicts Barreau on the right of the floor with her cats, whilst his portrait of Carrington is the complex interweaving of many images on the right. Apparently Gertzel shows himself as the face inside the small box set between them. Here is a painting, The Love That Moves the Sun and the Other Stars, which she created in 1946. Leonora became attached to Hungarian photojournalist Americo Csiky Weiss, who, being Jewish, had also fled Europe. They married in 1946, and in 1947 she created Csiky, Your Country, another of her paintings full of interwoven tableaux. To grasp all the imagery poured into this painting would take much in-depth study and analysis. Carrington rarely commented on her work, so one has little clues from her herself, but this painting obviously interweaves aspects from the difficult lives of both Csiky and herself, with her wider philosophical and spiritual interests. Thus, for example, we see some small tableau at the bottom right, which may reflect alchemical imagery. Carrington is such a major figure, and her artwork often dense and full of complex references, that we will devote a whole lesson in this course to her work. Thus, here we have only shown a few paintings created immediately before and in the few years after the war. We will look at her immense output later. Remedios Varo was born at Girona, Spain. Her father was an engineer and would often bring back blueprints from his work, which the young Remedios would copy. When she was 16, she studied art at the San Fernando Fine Arts Academy in Madrid, the major art school in Spain, at which Picasso and Dalí had also studied. Varo became involved with left-wing politics, and in 1937 had to flee Spain with her husband, the poet Benjamin Perret, during the Civil War. She went to Paris and came into the circles of the Surrealists. Among her earliest Surrealist works is Le Désir of 1935 and The Double Agent of 1936. The upheaval of the war led to her and her husband having to flee Europe. In 1940 she was arrested apparently for sheltering a deserter from the French army. She sought the assistance of the Emergency Rescue Committee, and for a while she lived at the Villa Herbel. Here is a photo of Varo, Perret, Breton, Jacques Hérault, Varian Fry and others at one of the Surrealist auctions at the villa. Eventually, Varian Fry was able to find her and Perret sanctuary in Mexico. They arrived there at the end of 1941. Here is a photo of her in Mexico in 1943. Initially, she had to undertake commercial artwork in order to support herself, but it was during this time that she found her style and subject matter. We see how this suddenly appears almost fully formed in her 1943 painting, Landscape with Centaur's Tower. Many of the elements of her mature style appear in this work: the wild overgrown wood, the geometric buildings or tall towers, the checkerboard floor, and the human figures set in a room with pulleys and clockwork mechanisms. We see more elements of the symbolic language she was creating. In her 1945 painting, My Friend Agustin Lazo. Note the windmill on the top of the tower, which drives a mechanism within the tower using pulleys, and also the female figure, perhaps Remedios herself, on a strange windmill-powered bicycle. She also includes her characteristic device of a tiled or checkerboard floor, which gives a strong perspective. Agustin Lazo was an established Mexican painter, credited with introducing Surrealism into Mexico. Varo, like her closest friend, Leonora Carrington, was deeply immersed in esotericism, spirituality, and magic. They shared an interest in alchemy and its symbolism. Her 1947 painting, The Laboratory, draws on alchemical imagery. She was especially interested in the idea of the relationship between macrocosm and microcosm, and depicted the way the stars drive events on Earth, using the amusing device of pulleys and wheels, as in her painting Premonition of 1953. Her incredible mastery of figurative painting is seen in one of her best-known works, The Revelation of the Clockmaker, created in 1955. Luckily for us, she wrote about this painting and gives us some insight into what she was attempting to depict. This painting is about time. That is why there is a clockmaker, who in a sense represents our ordinary time. But through the window comes a revelation, and all of a sudden the clockmaker comprehends a whole lot of things. I've tried to make him look both astonished and enlightened. He's surrounded by a series of timepieces, all showing the same time, but containing a figure from very distinct epochs. I achieved this effect through different costumes. Each clock has a window with bars, like a prison. Over the next few years, she poured out more than 100 amazing paintings before her untimely death. Partly this was due to the support of Walter Gruen, an Austrian political refugee, whom she eventually married. She then had the freedom to devote her life to painting. The Useless Science of the Alchemist from 1955 shows the alchemist turning a wheel, which drives a complex set of pulleys within his tower. His checkered robe emerges continuously from the pavement. In his laboratory, something is being collected from the heavens and condensed as an essence in his distilling apparatus. Varo loved cats, and they appear in many of her paintings. This painting, The Paradise of the Cats, however, is entirely devoted to them. It is perhaps the most approachable and charming of her output. Harmony of 1956 is one of her major pieces, with its masterful depiction of an interior space. Again, we are lucky that Varo commented on this painting. She writes, "This person is trying to find the invisible thread that connects all things. So, on a musical staff made of metal threads, he places all sorts of objects, ranging from the simplest to a small piece of paper containing a mathematical formula, which per se means a whole lot of things. Once he manages to put all these different objects into place, by blowing air into the clef supporting the staff, he should produce music, which is not only harmonious, but also objective. That is, capable of moving the things around it, if that is the intention of the player. The figure coming out of the wall, who helps him, represents chance, a factor that comes into play so often in all discoveries, but this is objective chance. The mathematical formula that Varo depicts is the square root of -1, which is the basis of complex numbers, the foundation of quantum mechanics, and much of modern mathematical physics. A year later, she painted the wonderful Creation of the Birds. This shows a half-human, half-bird owl figure seated at an octagonal wooden table. In its left hand, this figure holds a triangular lens, which transmits and projects light through a window from a star onto a sheet of paper on the table. In a sense, this is probably meant to be the Platonic form of the bird, found in the spiritual world of the stars. The figure holds a paintbrush in its right hand and is painting the form of a bird. Although it is just finishing the tail, the rest of the bird is about to take flight out of the paper. This creator of birds uses 3 primary pigments, red, yellow and blue, from a palette which is fed from an alchemical still, which in turn appears to be extracting this from material gathered through a funnel from the heavens, again through an open window. The melodic notes of the bird's song are added from a violin around the creator's neck. Another major work, for which she is now well known, is her Woman Leaving the Psychoanalyst. Varo writes, "The woman leaving the psychoanalyst's office drops her father's head into a small circular well, which is the proper thing to do when leaving the psychoanalyst. The basket she carries holds yet more psychological waste, a pocket watch, symbolizing the fear of arriving late, etc. The psychoanalyst's name is Dr. F.J.A. Freud, Jung, and Adler. The rebellious plant of 1961 is explained in this way by Varo herself. This scientist is experimenting with different plants and vegetables. He is somewhat bewildered because there is an unruly plant. All the plants are growing shoots in the form of mathematical figures and formulas, except for one, which insists on producing a flower. And the only mathematical branch it sprouted at the beginning, which has dropped onto the table, is very withered and weak. And besides, is mistaken, for it says 2 + 2 is almost 4. Each hair on the scientist's head is a mathematical equation." Varo is simultaneously profound and humorous. She created a series of deliciously amusing, absurd vehicles, such as Caravan, Winding Roads, and vagabond. Her last painting was Nature Resurrecting Death, and was created only a few days before she died of a heart attack in 1963. She was only 57 and at the height of her creative powers. Her best friend Leonora Carrington lived on to the great age of 94. Bridget Tichenor was of British descent, being from an extremely well-connected family. Her mother was related to many of the royal families of Europe, and she was part of the Baring banking family. Bridget was both wealthy and classically beautiful, and when young worked as a model for Coco Chanel. She studied art at the Slade School in London. In 1939, her mother arranged for her to be married to a wealthy American friend of Cole Porter, partly to get her away from the approaching war in Europe. Her marriage collapsed after she met Jonathan Tichenor in 1943, and she moved into a New York townhouse that she shared with Peggy Guggenheim. Thus, Bridget came to know all the circle of Surrealist artists. Her friend and cousin, Edward James, the British Surrealist art collector and sponsor of the magazine Minotaur, invited Bridget to visit him at Las Posas in Mexico, where he had built an amazing Surrealist sculptured garden. James had had a profound experience through spiritual initiations into Mesoamerican shamanistic magic that he had undergone, and he organized a similar initiation ceremony for Bridget into a secret Aztec Tonantzin sect. This entirely changed her life, and in 1950 she moved to Mexico, where she lived for most of her life and devoted almost all her time to painting. She had a close friendship with Leonora Carrington and Remedios Varo. Here is one of her works from 1956, The Surrealists, which is a group portrait of Carrington, Chiqui Weiss, Cati, and Yossi Horna, and others. The egg is used as a symbol for the artists hatching the Surrealist movement in Mexico. She developed a painting technique based upon 16th century Italian tempera formulas that artist Paul Cadmus taught her in New York in 1945. She would prepare an eggshell-finished gesso ground on a masonite board and painted by applying with small brushes many transparent oil glazes instead of tempera. This produced a polished, jewel-like surface to her paintings. Here is Tribute of 1963. She developed her own symbolic language and peopled her paintings with various strange beings, often enclosed in egg forms. In The Missionaries of 1965, a large priest-like form stands on a little hill by the sea and appears to be trying to instruct a group of human-headed dog beings. In the 1960s, she bought the Contembo Ranch on top of a steep hill overlooking Lake Pátzcuaro, about 6 hours' drive from Mexico City. She had a staff of 25 Indians, many of which were either crippled or have some abnormality that made them outcasts of the local village. Each servant had one specific job to do each day. For example, one crippled man had a job unpacking 25 parrots that were trained to sleep in stacked shoeboxes near a fireplace and place them on their perches each day at sunrise. It took him the morning to get them out and fed, and the afternoon to put them all back. She was surrounded by animals she adopted. Thus the world she created in her artwork is peopled with what she saw as animal spirits and humans interacting. She also had a delicious sense of humour, as in Turtle Ride of 1968 and The Idealist. In 1972, she produced a pair of paintings which shows figures dreaming on stylized canopied beds. Firstly, one of her best-known works, Sweet Dreams, and The Golden Sleep of Sunrise. One of her portraits of Maria Felix, the Mexican film actor, depicts her within a transparent crystal cube, being approached by various insects and snakes. While her second portrait of Maria shows her as a chimera tamer. Her work was not seen much in her lifetime, but a major retrospective was staged in Mexico City in 2012. In this photo taken at the Exposition, we get a sense of the small size of her paintings. In the late 1970s and into the 80s, she became engaged with the image of the mask and produced a series of mask images. She was an intensely private individual, and for most of her time in Mexico lived in a remote house and did not especially welcome visitors. Luckily, she developed a close friendship with Zachary Zelig, the American artist and writer on Kundalini and other spiritual matters, and he was able to record much of the details of her life. Hopefully, this will one day be published with illustrations of her paintings. Our next lesson will be on verist and biomorphic surrealism and the emergence of abstract expressionism.